When I first started doing this study, my plan was to look at the times when Jesus quoted from the book of Psalms and then look at the psalm to try to understand the psalm so that we can understand what Jesus was teaching when he referred to the psalm. And I've stuck with that pretty well. Jesus also quoted from the prophets, not just from the Psalms. And we're going to look at one of the prophecies today. Um, it's the same. We need to understand the prophecy so that we can understand what Jesus was trying to teach us with the reference to the prophecy. Why the reference to Jewish scriptures matters shows up in a conversation that Jesus had with his disciples that's recorded for us in Matthew. Jesus is answering a question that the disciples have asked him. And Jesus replies with a reference to a prophecy. And we have to understand the prophecy to be able to understand Jesus' answer. But first, we have to understand the disciples' question. I'm going to read to you from Matthew 13, starting in verse 10. And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" He answered and said to them, "Because it has been given you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, 'Hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them.'" Okay, let's understand the question. Why do you speak to the multitudes in parables? The disciples are asking Jesus. So what's a parable to our Western mind? Parables to us have been very puzzling. Questions like, why are there a bunch of virgins running around with lighted lamps at a wedding, or not lighted lamps, as the case may be? Why is there a bridegroom and no bride? And what's the deal about knocking on your neighbor's door at midnight and asking him for food? And then there's the one where all the workers get paid the same wage regardless of how many hours they worked. That is deeply disturbing to our Western capitalistic mind. And then there's the one about the dishonest steward who gets lauded. What do we do with that one? He gets praised by Jesus, supposedly. So a lot of stuff about parables that we don't understand. So we assume that Jesus' listeners didn't understand them either. So when we hear Jesus' answer to why he teaches them in parables, if we're confused, they must be confused. So it sounds to us like there are certain people that Jesus did not want to understand what he was trying to say. Now, a parable to an Eastern mind sounds different than it does to us. These stories that Jesus tells are set firmly in their cultural traditions. They're not puzzling to these people at all. These people understand what Jesus is saying. They know exactly what the deal is with the virgins running around with oil in their lamps or not, as the case may be. They're not confused by these stories. This is in contrast to a way of teaching that the Greeks were using starting about 200 years earlier and stretching on into several hundred years later, which was a more allegorical method of teaching. The Greek oracles and a lot of their poetry were written in very confusing language. The Greeks were on the fringes of the Jewish society. The two were knocking up against each other, pushing at each other on their borders. So there were Greek techniques being used in teaching. Some of the scholars talk about the oracles and the poetry and describe them like this. Often they used obscure language, and there needed to be an interpreter. Someone needed to interpret what the poet or the oracle was trying to say. Somebody needed to be inspired to understand. If you were listening, you needed somebody to tell you what they meant. A lot of times, from our Western perspective, this is what we think of as in parables. But Jesus' listeners didn't need somebody to interpret the parables for them. So there's this contrast between those two methods of teaching. One is a method that needed inspiration and interpretation. The other, the parable method, people just understood. So in light of this, let's reframe our idea of what the disciples are asking Jesus. They're not saying, why are you teaching the people in this confusing manner? They're saying exactly the opposite. Why are you teaching these people in a way that is easy for them to understand? When we reframe the question, we have to look at the answer a little bit differently. So we're going to go to Isaiah and look at Jesus' answer, because that's where this comes from. It comes from Isaiah 6. But first I want to remind you of something I said a couple of videos ago. One of the ways that rabbis taught was when they wanted to reference scripture, they would say just part of what they wanted their disciples to think, and they expected their disciples to be able to supply the context, to supply the rest of the quotation, the passage, and to understand what was happening at the time. We talked about that for Psalm 22. Well, this is another one of those times when Jesus is giving them just part of a quotation, and he expects them to understand the context. We are going to take a look at that context. So let's go to Isaiah 6, and this is verse 9 and 10 that Jesus is quoting just directly from. Before we read it, I want to say a word about translations here. There are three different ways that the verbs in this prophecy are translated. Some translations have God as the actor on the person that is being talked about, the people that are being talked about in the prophecy. So it's God that hardens their heart. Some translations look at it as the angel is commanding the prophet Isaiah to go harden the people's hearts. It's the prophet's responsibility to harden their heart. And some translations read like the people are hardening their own heart. We're not talking about the pros and cons of all the three different ways of translating. I'm going to read to you from the Septuagint that's translated to English. And so the Septuagint translates leaving the verbs passive. And I'm not going to get off on that either, so don't worry about that. We're not having an English class here. But I want to read to you from the Septuagint, so that just explaining this so that if you're looking at something different, you'll know why it's sounding different when I'm reading it than when you're reading it. Before I read it, though, I want to give you the background of what's happening here. So Isaiah has just been chosen to be the prophet, and this is his inaugural message that he's supposed to be giving. The Lord has just said to him, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." And then God gives him this message to give to the people. So here it is. You will be hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. This people's hearts have become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes, lest perhaps they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. So this is what Jesus has just quoted in answer to why he teaches in parables. We're going to take a look at the rhetoric, first of all. I want to look at verse 14 first. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. I'd like to tell you a story to illustrate this concept of hearing but not understanding and seeing but not perceiving. This is a true story. This happened up in Eagle River several years ago. There was a shooting. A woman came into a house and she shot the man, she shot his wife, and then she shot herself. The man and the shooter both died, but the wife did not die. She called 911, and Eagle River had just had installed in their emergency system a map system where they had everybody's phone number hooked to a place on the map, and so they could tell right away where people were calling from. This is before cell phones were a big deal. So So they knew where she was. They didn't have to ask her. So they said, okay, we're going to send out an ambulance for you. Just hang on. And they kept her on the phone. So they're talking to her on the phone, and the ambulance is coming. And she hears the sirens come, and then they disappear off into the distance. And she tells the dispatcher that they didn't come. They kept going. And the dispatcher reassured her, saying, oh, no, we know where you are. They're coming right to where you are. Well, she didn't hear the sirens again, and they didn't come. And so she kept saying, they're not here. They're not here. And the dispatcher assured her that they were right in her driveway. They said, do you have a motorhome? Do you have an American flag on your house? And she's like, no, I don't. The dispatcher was like, okay. Turns out their computer system was wrong. They didn't know where she was. And the dying woman was trying to tell them, turn right, turn left. No, that's not the right road. The name of my road is this. This is my house number. That's not my house number. And they wouldn't listen to her because they had their computer. And they had their face in their computer, and they were staring at the computer and following the route that they thought would take them to where she was. Eventually, they did get to her house, and she did not die. But I thought this was a really good illustration about hearing but not understanding. The dispatcher heard her on the phone telling them where she was, but the dispatcher had a different idea. The dispatcher was looking at different information, and the dispatcher thought that she understood where the woman was, but she didn't. She could see on her computer, but she couldn't see out on the street where the woman was, so she couldn't perceive what the problem was. So she was hearing but not understanding. She was seeing but not perceiving because her basis was wrong. She thought her basis was correct, but it was wrong. And so we see here that Jesus is saying about the people, their basis is wrong. They expect the Messiah to look a certain way, and he's not going to look that way, so they don't understand. That's how this starts out. That's how this prophecy starts out, and Jesus is referring to this part of it. And then we get to verse 15, which is a very fine example of a chiastic structure. It's the Hebrew, basic classic Hebrew rhetoric. It's very easy to see because, let me read it to you again. The people's hearts have become callous. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes, lest perhaps they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts. So do you see the hearts in that passage? The people's hearts have become callous. They understand with their hearts. And then how about the ears? Do you see the ears? They hardly hear with their ears. And then they do hear with their ears. And then let's look at their eyes. They have closed their eyes, and then they see with their eyes. And that brings us right to the center, which, as you know, the center of a chiasm is the turning point, the important part of what's happening here. And that is the lest perhaps, or otherwise, or perchance. These are all ways that this is translated. In English that we would say now, unless it happens that. So the turning point comes right there. They are like this, they're calloused, they're deaf, they're blind. But maybe it will happen that they will be able to see, that they will be able to hear, they will be able to understand. And if they turn, then I will heal them. That's what Jesus' answer to his disciples' questions is. I teach in parables so that their deaf ears can hear again, their blind eyes can see again, and their calloused hearts can understand again. If we move farther along in the prophecy in Isaiah, we get down through verse 11 to verse 11, and Isaiah asks the angel that he's talking to, how long? And it's a little bit unclear exactly what he's asking is going to be how long. How long will they keep on hearing and not understanding, keep on seeing and not perceiving, or how long until this is going to turn? But we're not going to talk about that part either. So we're just going to see what it's going to look like. So Isaiah says, how long? And the angel tells him, until the cities are laid waste, until the land is desolate. This, he tells them a little bit longer than the words that I'm saying. But all this is going to happen. And then something's going to happen. I'm going to read this part. As a terebinth tree or as an oak whose stump remains when it is cut down, so the holy seed shall be its stump. So that's how long it's going to be. We have a picture here of a desolate wasteland. The cities are laid waste. The land is desolate. But picture a burned out stump of a tree. God is saying through the angel to Isaiah that there will be left a stump of a tree. A couple chapters later in Isaiah, we read this. Isaiah 11, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Okay, this is obviously a prophecy about the advent of Jesus Messiah. So we're going to take our understanding of this prophecy back to Matthew. So why does Jesus speak to them in parables? Because first of all, let me go back to Matthew. The disciples have been given an understanding in verse 11, that's what it says, that the multitude, not so much. They haven't got to live their life, their days with Jesus. They haven't seen the ins and outs and haven't had the conversations. So they don't have the understanding that the disciples have. But they think that they see, and they think that they hear, and they are convinced that they know and understand what the Messiah is going to look like. But their hearts are dull. Jesus says their ears are deaf, their eyes are blind. So he speaks to them in parables so that their eyes will be opened, so that their ears will be opened, to bring understanding to their hearts so that they will turn, and I will heal them, is what the prophecy says. And by Jesus referencing this prophecy, he is taking responsibility for that healing. So, how long? Isaiah asked. Well, the time is up. The stump of Jesse has produced the branch. The holy seed has produced the shoot. Jesus called Emmanuel. God is with us. Let the healing begin.